A nor'easter screams across Boston. On a frozen, windswept loading dock, a German shepherd named Shadow plants himself between a 10-year-old boy and the billionaire who owns the building. The steel is slick with ice, a piece of wire scrapes against a heavy padlock, and a rusted tea-tin is hidden in the boy's jacket, like a final promise. Behind a mask of perfect public grief, a brother-in-law plans to inherit an empire. He thinks the truth of what happened on the yacht is buried forever at sea, but a small black notebook is more than a diary. Inside it, a dead child's secret audio file captured the truth. And when Shadow and Leo are brought in from the cold, the past will shift from accident to evidence, and a billionaire's sterile penthouse will shift from a tomb to a trap. What happens next will make you believe in quiet miracles and second chances for the forgotten. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your country in the comments below. If you believe no child or animal should ever face fear alone, hit subscribe now and share this story with someone who needs hope. The nor'easter didn't just arrive, it declared war on Boston. It came screaming in off the Atlantic, a white-knuckled fist of Arctic air that scoured the historic brickwork of Beacon Hill and turned the narrow, gas-lit streets into blinding tunnels of ice. The wind was a physical thing, a high-pitched keen that drowned all other sound, a relentless assault that buried the city in a suffocating frozen blanket. High above the chaos, in a penthouse that was more curated void than home, Arthur Pennington watched the city disappear. His light was the only one for blocks, a cold beacon in the swirling white. The apartment was silent, the kind of absolute heavy quiet that only immense wealth and profound loss can buy. At 48, Arthur was a man defined by what he had built and what he had lost. He was the architect of Pennington Data Solutions, a name synonymous with predictive analytics. His face, reflected in the storm-lashed glass, was all sharp angles and disciplined control, a strong jaw, a short beard neatly flecked with gray, and eyes the precise cold quiver of the frozen Charles River. 3 years ago, those eyes had watched a Coast Guard cutter return to the harbor without his wife, Eleanor, or his 8-year-old son, Julian. The Ethel tragedy, the media had called it, a rogue wave, a catastrophic mechanical failure on their yacht. For Arthur, it was simply the date the clock stopped. His work continued, a relentless forward momentum, but the man himself had become a ghost in his own life, a hollowed-out shell of logic and routine. He'd dismissed his driver. He always did in these storms, craving the sharp, tactile reality of the wheel, the fight of the tires against the ice, anything that felt real. He was on an unnecessary detour through the Seaport District, a mechanical habit of checking his assets. One, in particular, was an old brick warehouse from the shipping era, a relic on his balance sheet, slated for demolition to make way for another tower of glass and code. It was worthless. As his Audi A8's headlights cut through the vortex of snow, they snagged on something that shouldn't be there. Arthur's foot hit the brake, the anti-lock system pulsing silently, the car sliding to a controlled stop. It wasn't debris, it was alive. A dog. A German shepherd, massive and solid black, its form almost invisible against the wet, dark brick until it moved. It stood with a definitive, unsettling stillness, a low rumble vibrating from its chest, its ears pinned forward, and it was guarding something, or someone. Behind the dog, hunched against the loading dock's heavy steel door, was a boy. He was small, no older than 10, his small frame swallowed by a soaked, oversized jacket. His hands, raw and red, were not banging for help. They were working, deftly, at the industrial-grade padlock with a thin, glinting piece of wire. Arthur's first reaction wasn't pity. It was a cold, sharp spike of irritation at the sheer inefficiency of it all, a vandal, a stray, a problem to be solved. He cut the engine, plunging the scene into the eerie, muffled quiet of the snow, and stepped out. The wind hit him like a physical blow, a solid wall of ice that stole his breath and stung his eyes. "Shadow! Watch!" The boy's voice was a high-pitched command, surprisingly firm, cutting through the howl of the wind. The dog didn't bark. It simply moved, a fluid black shape planting itself squarely between Arthur and the boy. Its lips pulled back from its teeth in a silent, professional snarl. Its gaze was not panicked, it was analytical, tracking Arthur's every move. The boy scrambled to his feet, the piece of wire vanishing into a pocket. He was small, wiry, and his face was smudged with grease and dirt. His eyes, quick and assessing, darted from Arthur's expensive overcoat to the car and back. They showed no fear, only calculation. "He won't move," the boy said, his voice tight. "Shadow, stay." The dog held, a coiled spring of muscle and malice, its breath pluming in the frozen air. Its intelligent brown eyes never left Arthur. "That is private property," Arthur stated. His voice was flat, stripped of all emotion, carrying easily on the wind. "The lock's old. We just need shelter," the boy countered, not as a plea, but as a statement of fact. "Just till the storm passes, we'll be gone by morning." Arthur's gaze dropped from the boy's defiant face to the formidable dog, then to the heavy steel door they were trying to breach. The logical move, the efficient move, was to get back in his car, lock the doors, and call the Boston police. It was the sensible thing to do. But logic had felt very far away for 3 years. He stood motionless, the snow and ice already crusting on the shoulders of his overcoat, caught in a frozen tableau, a billionaire ghost, a desperate boy, and a dog that looked ready to guard the gates of hell. The silence on the loading dock stretched, pulled taut against the shriek of the wind. Arthur Pennington stood, an immovable object of wealth and logic, his tailored wool overcoat now heavy with melting snow. He stared at the boy, and the boy stared back, his small, dirty face a mask of defiant calculation. The dog, Shadow, remained a statue of coiled muscle, its low growl the only sound in their immediate bubble. The logical, efficient move was simple. Return to the heated leather of the Audi, call the Boston police, and let the city's overburdened system swallow them. The boy would go to a Department of Child Services intake, the dog to an animal control van. It was clean. It was procedural. It was not his problem. And yet, he hadn't moved. The boy's statement, "We'll be gone by morning," echoed. It wasn't a plea, it was a negotiation. Arthur's mind, trained to analyze data, saw the variables. The storm was worsening. The temperature was dropping into the single digits. Leaving them meant accepting the non-zero probability of them freezing to death on his property. The liability was distasteful. The optics, should they be found, were worse. "The police will separate you," Arthur said, his voice flat, stating a simple, immutable fact. The boy's chin lifted. "We know. That's why I was picking the lock. We go together, or we don't go." The "we" was absolute, a closed system that Arthur was not part of. For the first time in 3 years, Arthur felt an emotion that wasn't the dull ache of grief. It was irritation, sharp and clean. This anomaly was disrupting his routine. "You cannot stay here," Arthur said. "It's not safe. The structure is scheduled for demolition." The boy's eyes narrowed. "It's safer than the street." Shadow, sensing the stalemate, took a half step forward, its growl deepening. Arthur held up a hand, not in fear, but in a command for pause. "Get in the car," he said. The boy blinked, his defiant posture faltering for a second. "What?" "Get in the car, all of you." The boy's gaze flickered to the dog. "He won't leave Shadow." Arthur let out a slow, controlled breath, the cold air stinging his lungs. This was the messy, illogical part. "The dog, too. Get in the back, now, before I change my mind." The transition was a silent, tense operation. Leo, the boy, gave a short, sharp command, and Shadow instantly relaxed, becoming for a moment just a dog, but its eyes never left Arthur. The boy opened the rear door of the multi-$100,000 sedan and gestured. Shadow leaped in, his wet, muddy paws landing on the pristine, hand-stitched leather. Arthur's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The boy scrambled in after, huddling against the far door, a small, wary creature in a cage of obscene luxury. Arthur returned to the driver's seat, the silence in the car deafening, broken only by the rhythmic thwack-thwack of the windshield wipers and the low panting of the dog. The Audi's cabin, insulated from the outside, whirled, smelled instantly of wet dog and damp wool. He drove, not to a police station, and not to a shelter. He drove toward the one place he could control the variables, his home, the penthouse in Beacon Hill. The drive was short, a tense journey through streets that were almost completely deserted. When they ascended in the private elevator, which opened directly into his apartment, the culture clash was almost violent. The penthouse was a study in controlled minimalism. White marble floors, vast expanses of glass overlooking the storm, and curated pieces of severe modern art. It was a sterile, silent, and achingly clean environment, maintained with obsessive precision by his housekeeper, Mrs. Albright. And into this space, he had just introduced a muddy, streetwise child and a massive, soaking wet German shepherd. Shadow immediately shook his entire body, sending a spray of icy water across a 50,000 rug. Leo winced, expecting a shout. Arthur merely looked at the mess. "Kitchen," he commanded. "Now." He directed them to the adjoining utility and laundry room, a sterile space of stainless steel and tile. He tossed them a stack of old towels he used for the gym, not the guest linens. "Dry off, both of you. Stay on the tile." He left them, his mind already calculating the cost of a deep clean, the disruption to Mrs. Albright's schedule. He returned 10 minutes later with a bowl of water for the dog and a plate of food, leftovers from a meal his private chef had prepared, which Arthur himself had barely touched. It was artisan bread, aged cheddar, and slices of roasted chicken. Leo stared at the plate, then at Arthur. He took the plate, sat on the floor, tore the chicken into pieces, and placed them, one by one, in front of Shadow. The dog ate gently from his small, dirty hand. Only after Shadow had finished the protein did Leo pick up the bread and cheese and begin to eat, his movements fast but methodical, his eyes tracking Arthur the entire time. "Why my warehouse?" Arthur finally asked, breaking the silence. The boy shrugged, not stopping his chewing. "It's empty. It's solid. The wind's not so bad on that side." "That's not what I asked," Arthur pressed, his patience wearing thin. "There are hundreds of empty buildings in this city. Why mine?" The boy, Leo, swallowed the last piece of bread. He looked at the dog, who was now lying at his feet, exhausted but still alert. Then he looked back at Arthur, his gaze unnervingly direct. "Because it's yours," Leo said quietly. "I know the logo, the PDS compass on the door. I've seen it before." Arthur frowned. "How?" The boy took a deep breath, as if bracing himself. "I knew Julian," he whispered. The name hit Arthur Pennington with the force of a physical blow. It was a name that was never, ever spoken in this house. The silence that followed was heavier than the storm, heavier than the grief. Arthur's carefully constructed world, his logic, his routines, his cold, hollow emptiness, cracked. He felt the floor drop out from under him. "What did you say?" he breathed, his voice barely a rasp. Leo looked down, his hand automatically finding the fur on Shadow's neck. "Julian. He used to come to the park by the esplanade. He'd sneak out. He gave me food. He was nice. He talked to me." Arthur leaned against the steel doorframe, his legs suddenly unsteady. His son, his quiet, reserved, brilliant son, who he thought he knew completely, had been sneaking out to meet a homeless boy in the park. "He told me about the logo," Leo continued, his voice small. "He said his dad owned all those buildings. He said if I was ever in real trouble, real bad trouble, I should find one of the buildings with the compass. He said his dad would help." The name, Julian, hung in the sterile air of the utility room, a heavy, impossible ghost. Arthur Pennington, a man who had not taken an unsteady breath in 3 years, felt the world tilt. The cold till beneath his feet, the hum of the high-end appliances, the faint lingering smell of wet dog, it all receded, replaced by the roar of blood in his ears. His son's name, spoken by this dirty, defiant child, was a violation. It was an intrusion into the surgically clean, hermetically sealed vault of his grief. He had built his life on the foundation of that loss, a cold, hard, logical structure, and this boy, with a single word, had just taken a sledgehammer to it. He saw the boy, Leo, flinch, reading the sudden, dangerous stillness in Arthur's posture. Shadow, the German shepherd, seemed to grow larger, a low vibration starting in his chest as he sensed the chemical shift in the room. "Where?" Arthur said, his voice a low, controlled rasp. "Did you hear that name?" Leo's wary eyes met his. "I told you. I knew him." He scrambled to his feet, putting himself in front of the dog. "He was my friend." Arthur turned, not because he wanted to, but because the utility room was suddenly too small, the air too thick. He walked out, his footsteps echoing on the white marble floor, and didn't stop until he reached the center of the main living area. The room was a monument to his isolation, a cavernous space of glass and steel, with a 20-foot wall of windows that looked out onto the screaming white vortex of the nor'easter. The furniture was sparse, architectural, and punishingly uncomfortable. It was a room designed for viewing, not for living. He turned. The boy and the dog had followed, 2 dark, messy aberrations on his pristine white rug. Shadow was glued to Leo's leg, his head on a constant scanning swivel, his claws ticking nervously on the stone. "Sit," Arthur commanded, gesturing to a low-slung black leather sofa that cost more than a mid-sized car. Leo hesitated, looking at the sofa and then at his own muddy pants. Arthur's patience snapped. "Sit." Leo sat, perching on the absolute edge of the cushion, as if ready to bolt. Shadow sat instantly at his feet, a perfect black sentinel. Arthur remained standing, looming over them. "Talk," he said. "Start from the beginning. If you are lying to me." He didn't finish the threat. He didn't have to. Leo's hands were twisting in his lap. "I'm not lying." He spoke to the floor, his voice small but clear. "It was a while ago, before. I was in the park by the Esplanade, the one with the cannons. Shadow was just a pup then. This kid came up. He wasn't scared of Shadow, not like the other ones. He just sat down." Arthur's heart hammered against his ribs. The Esplanade. Julian had loved that park. He'd taken him there himself, a lifetime ago, to watch the 4th of July fireworks. "He had a backpack," Leo continued, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "A red one. He had these peanut butter things with chocolate. Good ones, not the stale kind. Reese's Cups," Arthur's mind supplied, the word a fresh stab. Julian's favorite. "He gave me one, and he gave Shadow his sandwich, ham and cheese. He said his cook always packed too much. He just talked to me, asked me about Shadow, asked me where we slept. He thought we were cool. He said we were urban survivors." Leo said the words carefully, a borrowed phrase. "He kept coming back, maybe once, twice a week, for a few months. He'd tell his nanny he was at the library. He was smart. He showed me how he'd sneak out. He liked us." Arthur saw it, a picture so clear and painful it stole his breath. His quiet, rule-following son, living a secret life, his pockets full of stolen candy, sitting in the dirt with a street kid and a dog. A son with a capacity for kindness and rebellion Arthur had never known. "And then he stopped coming," Leo said, his voice going flat. "I waited. I thought he just forgot, or got bored, like everyone does. Then I saw his picture in a newspaper I found in a trash can. It said, 'Tragic accident. Boating.' I didn't know what it meant, not really, but I knew he wasn't coming back." The room was silent again, the storm outside the only movement. Arthur closed his eyes. The logical part of his brain was screaming. Coincidence. A grift. The boy saw the name on the building and researched it, but his gut, the long, dormant, human part of him, knew it was the truth. The detail about the peanut butter cups. The phrase, "urban survivors." It was Julian. "Why are you here?" Arthur asked, his voice softer but heavier. "Why now? That was 3 years ago." Leo's demeanor changed. The brief flicker of warm memory was gone. The wary, calculating survivor returned. "Because he told me to," he said, his hand going to the inside of his oversized, soaked jacket. "He said, 'My dad's important. He's a lot. But he's good.' He said if I was ever in real bad trouble, I should find you. And I am, Mr. Pennington. I'm in trouble." "The storm," Arthur said, waving a dismissive hand. "No," Leo said, his voice dropping. "Not the storm. Trouble. People. They took the spot where we were sleeping. They tried to take Shadow." The boy's hand tightened on the dog's fur, and Shadow let out a low, preemptive growl. "We've been running for 2 days. This was the last place I knew to go. I have to give you the box." Arthur frowned. "Box?" Leo pulled his hand from his jacket. He was holding a small, rectangular tin box. It was old, the blue and white paint of an Elm's Best tea tin, chipped and rusted at the edges. It was the size of a deck of cards. "He gave it to me," Leo whispered, holding it out with a trembling hand. "The last time I saw him, he said it was his insurance policy. He was laughing, but he was scared too. He made me promise. Promise you will keep this safe, Leo. Don't open it. Don't lose it. Don't let anyone see it. If I'm not around, and you're in that real bad trouble, you give this to my dad. Only him. Promise?" Leo looked up, his small, dirty face a mask of solemn duty. "I promised, and I kept it. It's yours. Arthur looked at the small, rusted tin. He reached out and took it. His hand, which had signed billion-dollar contracts, was shaking. The metal was cold. It was light. He fumbled with the lid, his fingers suddenly clumsy. It popped open with a faint shink. Inside, there wasn't much. Just a cheap plastic thumb-sized USB drive, the kind given away at trade shows, and a small black moleskin-style notebook, its elastic band still in place. Arthur's blood ran cold. He picked up the notebook. He recognized it. He had bought it for Julian himself, to practice his cursive. He opened the first page. It wasn't cursive. It was Julian's familiar, messy, left-handed printing. A list of dates, times, and a name, written over and over. A name that made no sense. The name of his wife's brother. Uncle Duncan. Uncle Duncan. Uncle Duncan. Uncle Duncan. The name was an absurdity, a statistical error in a high-stakes calculation. Arthur Pennington's world was one of predictable outcomes, of algorithms and data sets that quantified risk and defined reality. Duncan Vance, his charming, affable, slightly feckless brother-in-law, did not belong in this equation. Duncan was the one who managed the family's philanthropic endeavors, a man who excelled at black tie galos and weeping eloquently at funerals. He was the one who, after the Ethel tragedy, had clung to Arthur, tears streaming down his face, vowing to keep Eleanor's memory alive by dedicating his life to the foundation she had built. The pairing of his name with Julian's scribbled panic was a cognitive dissonance that Arthur's logical mind couldn't resolve, a child's game, a misunderstanding. And yet, the cheap plastic USB drive sat in his palm, heavy as an anchor. Insurance policy. Real bad trouble. These were not the words of a child at play. They were the borrowed, half-understood echoes of an adult, and far more terrifying reality. He turned, his movement abrupt, and looked at the kitchen entrance. The boy, Leo, was still perched on the edge of the ruinously expensive sofa, a small, tense ball of nervous energy. The dog, Shadow, hadn't moved, his head still resting on his paws, but his intelligent eyes tracked Arthur's every micro-expression. They were the messengers, the living, breathing data packets that had brought this impossibility into his sterile home. He needed to contain the variables. "You," he said, his voice clipped. "In the kitchen, now." Leo sprang up, relieved to have a clear directive. He and Shadow followed Arthur to the vast, high-tech kitchen, a cold cathedral of stainless steel and black granite. "You will stay here," Arthur commanded, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "Do not leave this room. Do not touch anything. There is a guest bathroom through that door. Otherwise, you stay." Leo, who had spent a lifetime learning how to make himself invisible and follow the rules of hostile environments, simply nodded, his hand already buried in Shadow's thick fur. He sat on the cold tile floor, pulling the dog close. Arthur shut the heavy oak door, and Leo heard the quiet, definitive click of the lock. Arthur walked, his steps measured, to his study. This was his sanctuary, his fortress. The room was dark, paneled in rich mahogany, one wall dominated by a bank of glowing monitors, the others by floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. The air smelled of old leather and ozone. He sat in his chair, a high-backed throne of black leather and chrome, and looked at the USB drive. It was blue, emblazoned with the logo of a long-defunct software company. He slid it into the port of his custom-built workstation. A drive icon appeared on his main screen. He clicked. One file, a zip archive, password protected. Arthur's fingers flew across the keyboard. He tried the obvious. Julian, Ethel, Eleanor, Boston, Pennington, access denied. He tried dates. Julian's birthday, the date of the accident, access denied. He paused, his mind racing. A child's password. It would be simple, something personal. He thought back to Leo's story. Reese's Cups. He typed it. Access denied. He remembered the other phrase, the one that had made him smile, just for a fraction of a second, before the grief returned. The phrase Julian had used to describe them. He typed, Urban Survivors. Access granted. The file unzipped, revealing a single, cryptic audio file, JVD0614M4A. Arthur put on his studio-grade noise-canceling headphones, sealing himself off from the world, and pressed play. He listened. And the foundation of his world, the cold, hard certainty of his grief, crumbled to dust. He listened again, And a new emotion, one he hadn't felt in 3 years, burned through him, scalding and pure. Rage. It wasn't enough. The audio was ambiguous, damning, but not definitive. It was a child's recording. It was his son's voice, whispering, terrified. But it wasn't enough for the world he lived in. He needed more. He needed someone who knew how to navigate the world outside his algorithms. His mind flashed back, not to the boardroom, but to the gray, sterile police briefing room 3 years ago, the bearer of the official news. Most of the men had been uniforms, stiff and uncomfortable. But there was one, the lead detective. He hadn't been in uniform. He'd been in a rumpled suit, a stain on his tie, and a weary, cynical expression that seemed permanently etched into his face. This was Detective Mike Russo. Russo was a Boston cop from the old school, a man in his late 50s with a stocky build that spoke of a former athleticism now softened by time and bad coffee. His face was a roadmap of long nights and too many bad days, with dark circles under his eyes and a nose that had been broken more than once. His graying hair was a mess, and he perpetually needed a shave. He had delivered the catastrophic failure verdict without flinching, his voice a gravelly monotone. But Arthur, a man who read data in human beings, had seen it. A flicker, a shadow of doubt in the detective's eyes as he'd read the official report. A micro-expression that said he was closing a case, not solving it. He was a man who knew a politically convenient answer when he saw one. Arthur needed that man, the man who had doubted. He spun in his chair, his fingers flying again, pulling up the old digital case file. Detective Michael Russo, BPD homicide. His direct line was listed. Arthur picked up his secure desk phone, the line encrypted. He dialed. It rang 4 times, and he was about to hang up when a gruff, sleep-filled voice answered. "Russo." The voice was like gravel in a blender. "Detective Russo," Arthur said, his own voice unnervingly calm, a mask of cold control. "This is Arthur Pennington." A long, heavy silence stretched down the line, filled only with static and the distant howl of the storm outside. "Mr. Pennington," Russo said finally, his voice suddenly sharp, all traces of sleep gone. "It's 3 in the morning, during a blizzard. This is not a social call." "No," Arthur agreed. "It is not. Look, if this is some private security thing, I'm not your guy. You have people for that. My people cannot help me with this," Arthur said, his knuckles white as he gripped the phone. "I need you. I need you to come to my home. Now." "Sir, with all due respect, I'm not driving across a frozen city on the word of—" "It's about the ethel," Arthur cut him off, the words like chips of ice. "It's about my wool, and it wasn't an accident." The silence on the other end was absolute. Arthur could hear the detective breathing. He could picture the man sitting up in a dark, lonely apartment, the gears of his tired, cynical mind finally turning. "I'm on my way," Russo said, and the line went dead. The click of the disconnected line was absorbed by the heavy silence of the study. Arthur Pennington sat in his leather throne, motionless. The only movement in the room came from the bank of monitors, their ambient glow reflecting in his cold, still eyes, and from the swirling, chaotic dance of the snow outside the windows. The rage he felt was a foreign object, a hot, liquid metal pouring into the frozen, empty spaces of his grief. It was an engine, powerful and new, and it was demanding an outlet. He had listened to the audio file 5 times. Each time, the small, terrified whispers of his son, a digital ghost, tore through him, and each time, the muffled, angry voices of his wife and her brother confirmed the impossible. He looked at the small, rusted tea tin on his desk. Julian's insurance policy, a child's game that had, 3 years later, become a billionaire's only weapon. He heard the ding of the private elevator. It was a soft, sophisticated sound. But in the 3 a.m. silence, it was as loud as a gunshot. He swiveled his chair to face the heavy mahogany doors of the study. He had activated the elevator from his desk. There was only one person it could be. The study doors opened without a sound. Detective Mike Russo stood in the doorway, and he was exactly as Arthur remembered, only more so. He was a man drowning in his clothes. His rumpled gray suit, which looked like it had been slept in for a week, was dark with melted snow. His tie, a grease-stained relic from another decade, was pulled loose. His face was a pale, doughy road map of exhaustion, his nose a network of broken capillaries, and the circles under his eyes were the color of old bruises. He needed a shave, and he smelled faintly of cold air, stale coffee, and the inside of a squad car. He stood for a moment, his red-rimmed, cynical eyes taking in the sheer, staggering opulence of the room. The mahogany, the leather, the art, the technology. It was a world so far removed from his own South Boston apartment that it might as well have been on the moon. His gaze landed on Arthur. "This," Russo said, his voice a gravelly rasp, "better be the second coming, Pennington. I just risked my life, and a perfectly good set of city-issued tires, to get here." Arthur said nothing. He simply gestured to one of the austere leather chairs opposite his desk. Russo lumbered in, dripping melted snow on the Persian rug. He didn't sit. He stood, his hands shoved deep into his trench coat pockets, a clear, get-on-with-it posture. "You said it wasn't an accident," Russo stated, his voice flat. "You're a tech guy. You know what an official report means. Catastrophic mechanical failure. Rogue wave. It was a tragedy. It's closed." "You never believe that," Arthur countered, his voice quiet. Russo's eyes narrowed. "What I believe and what the paperwork says are two different things. I'm a paperwork cop, Mr. Pennington. You want a priest? Go to church. You want a shrink? Call Back Bay. You want me? You better have more than belief." Arthur held the detective's gaze. "My evidence is unconventional. It has a source, and the source is in my kitchen, under lock and key." Russo's face, already weary, contorted in disbelief. "A source? In your kitchen? What the hell did I just walk into? You got some informant on a... Arthur stood, walked to the study door, and punched a code into the keypad. The heavy door swung open. "Follow me." Russo, with a long, suffering sigh, followed Arthur out of the study, across the vast marble expanse of the living room, and to the kitchen. Arthur paused, his hand on the handle, and looked at the detective. "The source is a child, and his dog. And they are the only reason you are here." He opened the door. The sight that greeted Russo was so bizarre it stopped him cold. On the floor of a kitchen that looked like a high-end restaurant supply showroom, a small, dirty, wiry kid was huddled against a massive, solid black German shepherd. The dog, Shadow, lifted its head, and a low, menacing growl rumbled from its chest. The boy, Leo, scrambled to his feet, pulling the dog back, his eyes wide with a new, fresh terror. He hadn't just been scared of the streets, he was terrified of Russo's uniform, which he had spotted instantly, even under the trench coat. "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph," Russo whispered, taking a step back. "Pennington, what is this? You called me out here for a runaway?" "This runaway," Arthur said, his voice sharp, cutting off Leo's panicked attempt to hide, "knew my son." That stopped Russo. The detective's tired, cynical gaze snapped from Arthur to the boy. He looked at Leo, really looked at him, his detective's brain, honed by 30 years of reading people, instantly firing. He saw the genuine primal fear, not of him, but of the uniform. He saw the defiant way the boy protected the dog. He saw the intelligence in the boy's quick, calculating eyes. "Talk," Russo said, his voice softening just a fraction. The cop voice disappearing, replaced by something else. "Tell me about Julian." Trembling, Leo told the story. He told it quickly, in the clipped, staccato sentences of a kid who had learned that talking to authority figures was dangerous. He told them about the park, the red backpack, the Reese's cups, the urban survivors. And as he spoke, Russo's skepticism began to visibly thaw. These weren't the invented details of a grifter. They were the small, perfect, useless truths of a child's memory. "And he gave me this," Leo finished, pointing to the rusted tea tin that Arthur was now holding. Arthur led them all back to the study, the most secure room in the house. Russo, now completely engaged, sat in the leather chair, his wet coat forgotten. Leo and Shadow huddled by the door, a small island of street grime in a sea of wealth. "The boy's story is the why," Arthur said to Russo. "This," he held up the small black notebook, "is the what." He handed it to Russo. The detective opened it. He scanned the pages of messy left-handed printing, the dates, the times, and the name. Uncle Duncan. Russo looked up, his face pale under the sallow light. "Duncan Vance? Eleanor's brother?" "Read the last page," Arthur said. Russo flipped to the last entry, dated 2 days before the Ethel set sail. Julian had written, "Mommy crying, Uncle Duncan yelling. He said she was ruining everything." He was in the engine room. He's not allowed in the engine room. Russo closed the notebook. He placed it on the desk. This is a child's diary, Pennington. It's something, but it's not a smoking gun. This, Arthur said, his hand resting on his keyboard, is the gun. He unmuted his speakers. He didn't want the headphones. He wanted the sound to fill the room, to make it real for all of them. The audio file, from the USB. He pressed play. The file JVD0614.m4a opened, and the sound of his son's last, terrified moments filled the mahogany-paneled room. It was faint, whispery. Julian, clearly hiding, his breath coming in small, panicked gasps. And in the background, muffled but clear, the argument, "Don't care what you call it, Duncan. It's theft. You've been stealing from the Foundation for years." Eleanor's voice, sharp, furious. "I was borrowing. I kept us afloat while he just sat on his billions mourning. I built this." Duncan's voice, high-pitched, defensive, righteous. "It's over, Duncan. I'm telling Arthur. I'm telling the police when we dock." A pause, a muffled sound, and then Duncan's voice, terrifyingly calm. "You won't. You can't. You don't understand what you're doing." Then, a new sound, a metallic click, 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 and then, the worst part, Julian's own voice, a frantic, terrified whisper into the recorder. "Mommy, what's Uncle Duncan doing down in the engine? I smell gas. Mommy, I smell..." The audio file ended. The silence that fell was absolute, heavier than the storm, heavier than 3 years of grief. Leo was crying silently, his small hand clamped over his mouth. Shadow was on his feet, whining, sensing the raw, agonizing emotion in the room. Russo sat frozen, his face ashen, his cigarillo-stained fingers gripping the arms of the chair. Arthur Pennington was a statue, his face carved from ice, his knuckles white on his desk. Russo was the first to speak. He didn't speak as a cop. He spoke as a man, his voice a horrified, broken whisper. He didn't know the kid was on board. He was just trying to kill his sister. He gassed the engine, set a timer, the mechanical failure, the rogue wave. Holy God. He looked at Arthur, his detective's eyes now blazing with a cold, righteous fury that matched the billionaire's. "He's been playing the grieving relative for 3 years. On your money." Russo stood, his weariness gone, replaced by a sudden, terrifying energy. "We have him, Mr. Pennington. We have him cold, but we have to move smart. This isn't just a murderer. He's a Vance. He's rich, he's connected, and he's your family. And we," he nodded at Leo, "have to protect the only witness who just brought him down." The silence that followed the end of the audio file was a raw, gaping wound. It was Russo who moved first, his weariness replaced by a cold, hard, kinetic energy. He stood and began to pace the study, his wet shoes squeaking on the priceless rug, his mind, the mind of a 30-year street cop, assembling the pieces. "He's a Vance," Russo said, his voice a low growl, more to himself than to Arthur. "He's not just a killer. He's rich. He's connected. He's been playing the part of the grieving, philanthropic brother-in-law for 3 years, probably on your money. We can't just walk up and cuff him, not at 4 a.m. in a blizzard, not with this." He jabbed a finger at the USB drive. "This is a godsend. It's a miracle. But his high-priced lawyer will call it the fantasy of a dead child and the ramblings of a street rat. He'll be out on bail before the snow melts." Arthur, his face a mask of controlled ice, looked up. "So, what do we do, detective?" "We bring him here," Russo said, his eyes hardening. "We bring him to your ground. We get him to confess. We need him to say the words." The plan was formed with the grim efficiency of a military operation. First, the witness. Russo went to the kitchen, his posture softer, the cop mask back in place. Leo, who was still huddled with Shadow, flinched when he entered. "Listen to me, kid," Russo said, kneeling, his knees cracking. You did good. You did the bravest thing I've ever seen. But now I need you to disappear for me, just for a little while." He gestured to Shadow. "You and your partner, we've got a bad guy coming, and he cannot know you're here. You're the ace, kid. We don't play the ace until the game is over." Arthur led them to a secure guest wing on the opposite side of the penthouse, a self-contained apartment used for visiting dignitaries, with its own entrance and soundproofed walls. Stay here. Do not make a sound, Arthur commanded, his voice tight with a new, strange emotion, protectiveness. No one will get in, Russo added, his hand on his service weapon. He made a call, not to dispatch, but to a trusted beat cop he knew was on the overnight shift, stationing him in the service hall outside the guest wing's private door. Officer Kincaid, he grunted into the phone. Quiet detail, high-value witness, no questions, just sit. With the witness secure, it was time to set the trap. Russo hooked a small digital recorder to the inside of Arthur's shirt, the wire running up his sleeve. It's not a wiretap if one party consents, Russo muttered. You're the consenting party. He starts talking, you just let him. He'll try to lie, he'll try to perform. You let him. Let him dig his own grave. Arthur looked at the phone on his desk. His hand was steady. He knew Duncan's private number by heart. He dialed. It's 4:30 a.m., Russo warned. He'll be disoriented. Be the grieving brother-in-law. Be confused. Be scared. But more than anything, be the man he's been stealing from. You're the one he has to manage. Go. The phone rang once, twice, a third time. Then a groggy, annoyed voice. Hello? Duncan. Arthur's voice was a masterpiece of broken, gravelly confusion. Duncan, thank God. You have to get here. Now. Arthur? What? What time is... Are you all right? Is it the storm? It's the police, Arthur said, letting his voice break. Detective Russo, he's here, at the penthouse. Duncan, he's asking questions about the Ethel. A sharp, definitive silence on the other end. The grogginess was gone. What kind of questions? Duncan's voice was suddenly sharp, alert. About the foundation, Arthur said, feeding the bait. About money, and God, Duncan, he's asking about the engine room. He's saying crazy things. I don't know what to do. I need you. I need you here. Another calculated pause. I'll be there, Duncan said, his voice tight with a new forced calm. Don't say another word to him until I arrive. I'll handle this, Arthur. I'll protect you. I'm on my way. Arthur hung up. He looked at Russo. He's coming. Of course he is, Russo said, his face grim. He's not coming to protect you. He's coming to find out how much we know. He's coming to destroy the evidence. The wait was the loudest silence Arthur had ever endured. The storm raged. Russo stood by the window, a dark, rumpled silhouette against the white. Arthur sat at his desk, the rusted tea tin and the small black notebook in front of him. 45 minutes later, the private elevator dinged. The doors slid open. Duncan Vance entered, and he was a performance. He was in his mid-40s, tall, and even at 5 a.m. in a blizzard, he looked like he'd stepped out of a magazine. He wore a dark, expensive-looking cashmere sweater, tailored wool slacks, and leather loafers. His blonde gray hair perfectly, artfully disheveled. His handsome, aristocratic face was a mask of deep, heartfelt concern. This was the man who had wept at the funeral. This was the man who ran the Eleanor Pennington Children's Foundation. Arthur, he breathed, rushing forward, his arms open. My God, are you all right? What is this madness? He stopped short, noticing Russo for the first time. Detective Russo, his voice turned to steel. I remember you. What is the meaning of this? Harassing a grieving man in his home, in the middle of the night? Have you no decency? Mr. Vance, Russo said, his voice bored, we're just clearing up an old file. An old file? Duncan scoffed, turning back to Arthur, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. Arthur flinched at the touch. It's all right, Arthur. I'll handle this. Detective, you will leave, now, or I will have your badge by breakfast. Is that what you told Eleanor? Arthur's voice was a low, dead whisper. Duncan froze. The hand on Arthur's shoulder tensed. What did you say? I said, is that what you told her? Arthur pushed the small, rusted tea tin across the polished desk. Duncan stared at it. What is this? Arthur, you're not well. The grief. He kept it, Duncan, Arthur said. He opened the tin. He took out the small black notebook. He kept it. Duncan's mask of concern didn't just slip. It shattered. His face went pale, his blue eyes wide, his gaze fixed on the notebook. He knew instantly what it was. Where, he whispered, his voice trembling. Where did you get that? He kept a record, Duncan, of the yelling, of the engine room. This is insane, Duncan sputtered, his performance returning, but it was frantic now, his eyes darting between Arthur and Russo. You're conspiring. This is libel. And he kept this, Arthur said. He picked up the blue USB drive. He slotted it into the speaker dock on his desk, and he pressed play. The room filled with the sounds, the whispers, the argument. Eleanor's voice furious, him stealing from the foundation, and then Duncan's voice, high-pitched, screaming, "I built this!" As his own voice echoed in the billion-dollar study, Duncan Vance lunged, a desperate primal howl tearing from his throat. "No! Turn it off! Turn it off!" He scrambled across the desk, grabbing for the USB drive. Russo was faster, his stocky body moving with a speed that belied his age. He grabbed Duncan's wrist in a steel grip and twisted, slamming him down onto the desk. "You don't understand!" Duncan shrieked, his handsome face contorted, tears of rage and panic streaming down his cheeks. The performance was over. Only the monster remained. "She was ruining me. She was going to tell you. She was going to destroy everything I built. I just had to stop her. I had to scare her. It was just a small fire, a warning, to stop the boat, to make her listen." He was sobbing now, a desperate, broken man. He looked at Arthur, his eyes pleading. "I didn't know, Arthur. I swear to God. I didn't know the boy was on board. I didn't know Julian was with her. It was an accident. It was her fault. She took him. I didn't mean to. I didn't mean to." The confession hung in the air, awful and complete. The room was silent, save for his ragged sobs. Russo, his face like stone, still holding the man's arm, reached inside his own coat. "Michael Russo," he said, his voice flat, his detective's shield glinting in his hand. "Duncan Vance, you are under arrest for the murders of Eleanor Pennington and Julian Pennington." The confession, a ragged torrent of self-pity and panicked truth, was sucked into the void. Duncan Vance's sobs were the only sound in the opulent study, a stark, ugly counterpoint to the howling of the storm. He was a crumpled, pathetic thing, his expensive cashmere sweater now stained with tears and snot, his aristocratic face a mask of ruined, animalistic terror. Arthur Pennington stood motionless, his face a sheet of ice. He felt nothing, not relief, not satisfaction, not even triumph. The rage that had burned through him was gone, leaving behind a cold, sterile vacuum. He had the truth, and the truth was 1,000 times more grotesque than the Rogic wave lie he had lived with for 3 years. His wife's brother, a petty, greedy, pathetic man. It wasn't a tragedy, it was a squalid, filthy crime. Detective Mike Russo, his face like stone, pulled Duncan's arm back with a sharp, painful crank, the sound of the metal handcuffs ratcheting closed, echoing with definitive finality. "You have the right to remain silent." Russo's voice was a dead, flat monotone, the gravelly procedural catechism of a man who had done this 1,000 times. "Anything you say can and will be used against you." Duncan had stopped fighting, his body dissolving into dead weight, his sobs devolving into pathetic, hiccuping gasps. The performance was over. The man was gone. Only the evidence remained. "He didn't mean to," Duncan whispered, a last desperate plea to Arthur. "Arthur, please, I didn't know the boy was on the boat. Tell them, I didn't mean to." Arthur Pennington looked through him, his eyes as cold and empty as the storm-lashed glass. He felt nothing at all. Russo pulled his phone, his movements all business. "I'm at the Pennington penthouse," he grunted. "I have a suspect in custody, homicide, multiple. Yeah, I know. I need a discreet car, service entrance, and I need the primary ME. This is the Ethel case." He listened. "No, it's not a joke. And yeah, it's that Ethel case." He hung up and began the meticulous procedural work of securing the scene. He bagged the small black notebook. He bagged the rusted Elm's Best tea tin. He bagged the blue USB drive. He bagged his own digital recorder, which now held the full, sobbing confession. "Chain of custody," he muttered, more to himself than to Arthur, his hands working with practiced, steady efficiency. "Mr. Pennington, this room, your study, is now part of an active investigation. Don't touch anything." Arthur merely nodded, his gaze distant. "There's one more thing," Russo said, his voice softening, the cop receding. The witness. Arthur's gaze snapped back into focus. He had forgotten. In the storm of the confession, he had forgotten the variables he had locked in the guest wing. Russo led the way. They walked through the silent marble expanse, the first, faint, bruised purple light of dawn beginning to stain the edges of the blizzard. The storm was breaking. They reached the guest wing. A young, uniformed officer was standing at attention by the door, his face sharp and his shoulders broad. "Officer Kincaid," Russo said. "Status?" "Silent, sir. Haven't heard a sound," Kincaid replied, his eyes respectfully avoiding Arthur's. "Good man," Russo said. He knocked softly. "Kid, it's Russo. It's over. We're opening the door." He keyed in the code, and the door opened. The guest suite was, like the rest of the penthouse, a picture of sterile, expensive luxury. And in the middle of the floor, looking impossibly small, sat Leo, his arms wrapped around Shadow's thick neck. The boy was trembling, his eyes wide and terrified, his face pale with exhaustion. He looked from Russo's rumpled suit to Arthur's cold, impassive face, his small body tensing, expecting, what, a blow, a betrayal? He didn't know the outcome. "It's all right, kid," Russo said, his voice softer than Arthur had ever heard it. "You're safe. We got him. He confessed. It's over." The breath left Leo's body in a single shuddering whoosh. He didn't cry. He just deflated, his small head falling forward to rest on the dog's back, his shoulders shaking. Shadow, who had been a statue of tense, protective muscle, let out a low woof, and his tail gave a single, tentative thump on the carpet. Russo, to Arthur's quiet astonishment, stepped forward and knelt, his knees cracking. "Hey, partner," Russo said, not to the boy, but to the dog. He extended a hand, palm down. Shadow sniffed it, then licked it. "That's a hell of a partner you got, kid," Russo said, scratching the big dog behind the ears. "Solid black. My grandfather had one. Smartest dog I ever knew." He looked at Leo. "You did a good thing, Leo. A terrifying, stupid, brave thing. You brought justice for that man's son." He stood, his dad moment over, the cop returning. "I've got to transport the suspect. A social services rep will be here in the morning, kid. They'll find you a warm bed." Leo's head snapped up, his brief moment of relief vanishing, replaced by the old, familiar panic. "What about Shadow?" Russo's face hardened. "The system's not great with pets, kid. They'll do their best." "No!" Leo scrambled to his feet. "We go together. I told him. We go together." "Detective," Arthur's voice cut through the tension. It was the first time he had spoken since the arrest. "I will handle the arrangements for the boy and the dog." Russo looked at him, a long, analytical stare. The billionaire, the cold fish. He saw the calculation in Arthur's eyes, but he also saw something else. A crack, a fissure. "All right, Pennington," Russo said, nodding slowly. "He's your witness. You handle it." He turned and left, his job done. Kincaid followed. The penthouse was silent again, but it was a new silence. It was Arthur and the boy and the dog. The storm was over. The night was over. Justice had been served, and Arthur Pennington had never felt so completely, terrifyingly, devastatingly empty. He stood in the center of his living room as the gray morning light filled the space, illuminating the dust motes and the small, muddy paw prints on his white marble floor. He had the truth. He had justice. Now what? What was he supposed to do with the rest of his life, now that the grief he had built it around was proven to be a lie, a filthy, pathetic betrayal? He had no data, no algorithm. He was lost. His gaze fell on the kitchen doorway. He walked to the guest wing. The door was still open. Leo was standing there, his small, tattered jacket on, his hand on Shadow's fur. He looked like he was ready to run again. "The storm's about over, mister," Leo said, his voice quiet, resigned. "We'll be gone, like I promised. We won't be no more trouble." He was ready to go back to the street, back to the fight. Their bargain was over. Arthur looked at him. The boy, the urban survivor, the kid who had kept a promise for 3 years, the kid who had brought him the truth, wrapped in a rusted tea tin, the only living, breathing connection to the son he had actually had, not the one he thought he'd known. Shadow, the massive, terrifying dog, took a hesitant step forward. He walked past Leo. He walked right up to Arthur, who stood frozen. The dog didn't growl. He didn't snarl. He sat. He looked up at the billionaire, and then he nudged his cold, wet nose into Arthur's motionless hand. Arthur flinched. He looked down at the dog, and then at the boy, and he made a decision. It wasn't logical. It wasn't efficient. It was something else. "No," Arthur said, his voice rough. "You're not going anywhere." Leo looked up, confused. It's morning," Arthur said, fumbling for the words. "Mrs. Albright, my housekeeper, she makes pancakes on Tuesdays. It's not Tuesday, but I'm sure she'd make an exception. You should stay for breakfast." Leo just stared at him, his mouth open. "Pancakes?" he whispered. "Yes," Arthur said. "Pancakes." "Pancakes." Leo whispered the word as if it were a foreign code, a sound he had heard but never used. His small, exhausted face was a mask of profound confusion. He had been offered shelter from the storm, a temporary bargain. He had been offered food, a strategic fuel. He had never, in his entire life, been offered pancakes. It was an invitation to a different world, one that didn't operate on the cold, hard logic of survival. Arthur Pennington, having just spoken the word, seemed almost as surprised as Leo. It was an illogical, inefficient, and utterly human impulse, and it had come out of his mouth before his data-driven brain could veto it. He, the man who hadn't shared a meal at his own table in 3 years, had just invited a street kid and his dog to breakfast. And he had no idea how to make pancakes. He cleared his throat, the sound overly loud in the dawn-lit room. "Mrs. Albright," he said, fumbling for a logical sequence. "My housekeeper, she manages the, culinary logistics." He looked at the clock, 6:07 a.m. He pulled his phone from his pocket, his hand, for the first time, not entirely steady. He pressed a speed dial number. "Mrs. Albright," he said when the line connected, his voice the familiar, clipped monotone of a CEO. "Good morning. I apologize for the hour. I require pancakes in the main kitchen as soon as you can." He paused, listening. "Yes, pancakes and bacon and everything. Thank you." He hung up, the absurdity of the request hanging in the air. 20 minutes later, Mrs. Albright arrived. She was a woman who was the physical opposite of the storm. She was all order, precision, and immutability. In her early 60s, she was a stern, fine-boned woman with silver-gray hair pulled into a bun so tight it seemed to defy gravity. She wore a pristine black housekeeper's uniform with a white starched apron. Mrs. Albright had been with the Pennington household for 15 years. She had organized Julian's birthday parties, and she had packed the suitcases for Eleanor's final trip on the Ethel. She had been the one to quietly, methodically remove all of Eleanor's and Julian's belongings from sight 3 years ago, creating the sterile mausoleum Arthur now lived in. She was a fortress of silent, efficient competence. And she was, perhaps, the only person on Earth Arthur Pennington was slightly afraid of. She entered the kitchen from the service elevator, her face a mask of professional neutrality. She stopped. Her gaze moved, with devastating, systematic slowness, from Arthur, who was standing in the middle of the kitchen in a wrinkled 24-hour-old suit, to the small, impossibly dirty, and terrified-looking boy standing by the sink, to the massive, solid black German shepherd sitting at the boy's feet, leaving a small puddle of mud on the white marble floor. She blinked once. Her nostrils flared, just a fraction. She looked back at Arthur. "Pancakes, sir," she said, her voice a calm, level, Eastern, European monotone. "Of course, and the companions? They are staying," Arthur said, the words feeling heavy and strange. "They are guests." Mrs. Albright looked at Leo. She looked at Shadow. She then looked at the state of her pristine kitchen, which now had a muddy dog in it. She took a long, slow breath, let it out, and walked to the industrial-sized refrigerator. "I will require the buttermilk," she said to no one in particular, "and I will need to sanitize everything." The hour that followed was a surreal, disjointed ballet. Mrs. Albright, with a quiet but terrifying authority, dispatched Leo to the guest suite shower, with an order to scrub until the water runs clear, mal chick. She provided him with a stack of towels and, after a whispered, tense conference with Arthur, a set of clothes. They were Julian's. They were from a box Mrs. Albright had sealed and stored, labeled Julian, age 8 to 10, winter. Arthur had to sit down as he watched Leo, now scrubbed pink, emerge from the bathroom, swimming in a pair of Julian's old flannel pajamas. The boy looked smaller, more fragile, his defiant, streetwise edges momentarily washed away. He looked, for a moment, like a child. They sat at the massive black granite island, Arthur at one end, Leo at the other. Mrs. Albright placed a stack of golden brown pancakes in front of the boy. Leo just stared at them. "You may eat," Arthur said, his voice stiff. Leo picked up the fork, his movements hesitant. He cut a piece, ate it, and his eyes closed, a small involuntary shudder of pure, unadulterated pleasure passing through him. He then, very methodically, cut the rest of the stack into small pieces and began to eat, fast but silent, as if afraid the food would be taken away. Mrs. Albright placed a similar plate in front of Arthur. He, who had lived on black coffee and nutrition bars for 3 years, picked up his own fork. And as the sun finally broke through the now clearing storm, the three of them ate. And under the table, Shadow, who had been fed a bowl of leftover roasted chicken by a completely bewildered Mrs. Albright, crept over and laid his heavy head on Arthur Pennington's expensive Italian leather shoe. 6 months later, Boston was in the full, glorious bloom of summer. The snow was a distant memory. The penthouse, however, was unrecognizable. The white, sterile rug in the living room now had a large, dark gray stain on it, the Great Juice Incident of April, as Leo called it, and was currently occupied by a bright yellow dog toy shaped like a chicken. The minimalist, architectural coffee table was covered in high school-level physics textbooks and a half-finished, chaotic-looking model of a volcano. Mrs. Albright's uniform was, miraculously, still pristine, but her stern bun was often loose by the end of the day, and Arthur had, on 2 separate occasions, heard her laughing at something the boy said. Arthur Pennington was in his study, but the room was different. One of the monitors, which had once tracked global stock indices, now tracked the progress of the Pennington Vance Foundation. After the trial, which had been short, brutal, and resulted in a life without parole sentence for Duncan, Arthur had liquidated the old Eleanor Foundation that Duncan had corrupted. He'd rebuilt it from the ground up, adding Duncan's surname as a permanent public mark of shame, and given it a new, dual-focus mission. The Julian Fund, providing comprehensive support for at-risk youth and homeless minors. And Shadow's Shelter, a sister fund that partnered with animal rescues across New England, specifically funding programs that kept owners and their pets together in shelters, ensuring no child like Leo would ever have to choose between a warm bed and his best friend. A buzzer rang, a new addition. "Dad!" Leo's voice, now confident and unbroken, crackled over the intercom. "You said 3 p.m. The Frisbee's not going to throw itself, man." Arthur looked at the screen, at the complex financial projections, and, for the first time in his life, hit close without saving. "I'm coming," he called out. He walked into the living room. Leo was waiting by the elevator, no longer the small, wiry survivor, but a lanky, healthy 11-year-old in a Red Sox cap, cargo shorts, and bright green sneakers. Shadow, his black coat gleaming with health, his body now filled out with muscle, was standing by his side, a red Frisbee clamped in his jaw. They walked out of the Beacon Hill apartment building, not into a blizzard, but into the bright, warm, honey gold light of a Boston summer afternoon. They crossed the street to the Boston Common. The park was alive with sound. Students, tourists, families. Arthur, now in a simple polo shirt and jeans, a man who looked less like a specter and more like a father, took the Frisbee. "All right, Shadow," he said. "Go long." He launched it, a long, smooth arc against the blue sky. Leo and Shadow ran for it together, a chaotic, laughing tangle of boy and dog, their shouts and barks echoing over the grass. Arthur watched them, his hands in his pockets. The grief for Julian and Eleanor was still there. It would always be there, a quiet, foundational ache. But it was no longer a vacuum. It was no longer an emptiness. It was just a part of him. He looked at the boy and the dog, wrestling on the grass, a new, loud, messy, and profoundly illogical variable that had saved him. Julian's last, brave act of kindness hadn't just brought justice, it had brought life. And for the first time in 3 years, as he watched his new family, Arthur Pennington, the man who had forgotten how, threw back his head and laughed. Sometimes, the miracles we pray for don't come as thunder from the sky. They come as a whisper in a storm. They arrive in the packages we least expect: a small, shivering boy, a loyal dog, a rusted tea tin holding the truth. This story teaches us that God often works through the hands of the forgotten. Julian's small act of kindness, sharing his food with a lonely boy, was a seed he planted. He could never have known that 3 years later, that seed would grow into a tree of justice, saving his father's soul and giving a new family a future. In our own lives, we are surrounded by opportunities to be a Julian. A small act of kindness, a moment of courage, a promise kept. These are the real-life miracles. They are the whispers of God in a noisy world. You never know whose life you are saving, or whose darkness you are illuminating, just by sharing your light. What did you feel when Arthur finally understood the truth? What part of Leo's and Shadow's journey touched your heart the most? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might be the miracle someone else needs to hear today. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that hope is real, and subscribe for more stories that prove faith and kindness can change the world. May God bless you, protect you, and keep you safe. We'll see you in the next story.